How's your hammer, everybody? I'm PTDevil, and welcome to another episode of The Deck Doctors. In this series, we'll be looking at some of the most unplayable archetypes in the whole game, figuring out why they're so bad, and designing some new support to help make them playable. The process we'll be using is examining what it is they do, diagnosing what their problems are, and prescribing a treatment for them to be less awful. With all that said, let's get to the video. If you had to pick, who would you say is the greatest writer of the English language? William Shakespeare? Geoffrey Chaucer? Perhaps Edgar Allan Poe? Or, if you have the unfortunate condition of being born in my generation, you might be inclined to go with this psychopath, a man whose inexplicable surge in popularity has skyrocketed so far out of control it allowed for shit like this to appear in public media. Research on Lovecraft
gets turned on by tentacles.
Okay, to be fair, there is some credibility to H.P. Lovecraft as a writer. The Cthulhu mythos are very immersive, and his worlds and creatures are beyond imaginative, if borderline nonsensical, which allows for a lot of creative freedom and adaptability no matter what medium you apply it to. Unless, of course, we're talking about the world's most negligent card game when it comes to archetype design, in which case we get entities. Strictly speaking, Entity is not a proper archetype on its own, but rather 3 separate sub-archetypes made into proper archetypes due to a single solitary support card that equally and individually supports all 3 of them for reasons unknown, and were designed to work in synergy with one another despite their visibly different playing styles. They debuted in the OCG during the early Pendulum era when Konami was trying to convince everyone that Fusion, Synchro, and Ixie summoning could still be viable, even though they came out at a time when we had shit like Shaddolls, Yang Zings, and Teller Knights as meta, and absolutely no one had a problem with that to begin with. Perhaps because of this reason, they seem to have switched to the fuck it adjustment almost immediately after this, resulting in what they did make turning out so ostensibly unfinished. And for some reason, they also decided to take their slow-ass time importing them to the TCG, to the point that by the time we got the full set, the idea had long since passed, and the engine, so to call it, had gone from somewhat inconsistent to borderline useless. So let's check the signs and see what can be done to help them. We start off, strangely enough, with one of the best cards both in the archetype and in the game in general. Eldar Entity Norden is a level 4 fusion monster, and if you're wondering why I'm starting with an extra deck monster instead of a main deck one, well, that's because there are no main deck monsters. Yep, apparently Konami wanted you to try to forcefully shove these guys into your extra deck without bothering to give you a consistent way to get them all out. Good job! Well, anyway, back to this. He's based off of Nodens, the most prominent member of the Elder Gods, and definitive proof that midlife crises exist even in mythology. He's a water fairy with 2000 attack and 2200 defense. He requires any combination of 2 Synchro and or Ixies monsters as material, and has the following effect. When this card is special summoned, you can target 1 level 4 or lower monster in your graveyard, special summon it, but its effects are negated, also banish it when this card leaves the field. At first glance, you may be wondering why this card is good at all, much less good enough to be forbidden in both the TCG and the OCG. His materials are way too much of a pain in the ass to bring to the field, to summon, and all he does is revive one of your low-level monsters, but then you remember that instant fusion exists, at which Norden becomes a free rank 4 that doesn't eat up your normal summon, and now in the Link era, you need all the free monsters you can get, so a free generic resource generator is greatly appreciated no matter what deck he's in. He's also the key player in setting up the entity's win condition, so now that he's forbidden, they basically have no chance whatsoever. Their other fusion monster is Eldar Entity. Like Norden, she's a level 4 fairy, only this one being a light attribute, and she's based off of... I honestly couldn't tell you. Apparently this bitch, although I couldn't find any information on what exactly she's supposed to be. She's got 2500 attack and 1200 defense, she requires 1 Synchro monster and 1 Ixies monster, must be special summoned from your extra deck by sending the above cards you control to the graveyard. You do not use polymerization. Once per turn, you can special summon 1 level 4 monster from your hand. If this card is sent to the graveyard, you can target 1 card on the field, destroy it. You can only special summon Eldar Entity Natis once per turn. It seems like Konami was actively trying to keep these cards as useless as possible outside of their own archetype, which only goes to infuriate me more given how they never followed through with any of it. Whereas Norden can be cheesed out by instant fusion, Natis cannot due to her being a strict contact fusion Nomi monster for some reason. Furthermore, she requires one of each Synchro Nixies monster as opposed to a combination thereof, which means she can't even be splashed in as a tech option in decks that can make a lot of one of those types. If she does somehow hit the field at all, then she's bound to put some work in, being able to bring out free resources and popping a card when she's used as material, although good luck setting up those conditions for bringing her out in any situation. If you're running this, you're doing so because you have a means to get her straight to the graveyard from the extra deck to pop a card on demand. Their first synchro is Old Entity Hastur, obviously based off of Hastur, which makes sense, although I still begrudge them for dressing him in the wrong fucking color. I mean, I guess it's kind of yellow, but given how prominent a color it's supposed to be for him, I was kinda hoping for something a little more... Yeah, that. But I digress. He's a level 4 wind reptile with 2300 attack and 1000 defense, requires any tuner and any non-tuner monsters, and has the following effect. If this card is sent from the monster zone to the graveyard, you can target one face-up monster your opponent controls, equip this card from your graveyard to that monster. That monster cannot attack, also its effects are negated. If this card leaves the field while equipped to an opponent's monster by this effect, take control of the monster this card was equipped to. As far as generic level 4 synchros goes, Hastur is definitely one of the better ones out there. Immediate and permanent effect negation is nothing to sneeze at, especially since the trigger for the effect is so insanely easy to pull off and is bound to happen simply by doing what you're supposed to be doing with your deck. To top it off, he has a reverse Gradle effect that snatches the monster if he is destroyed as an equipped card, so your opponent can't even MST negate it without losing the monster entirely. However, you may want to pop him yourself or otherwise take care of the equipped monster because your opponent still can dodge around it by using it as material before Hastur can snatch it. Still though, when used on a key playmaker or an important boss monster, he can easily turn the tides of the duel simply by hitting and leaving the field other than using him as Xyz material, which arguably is the whole point of the entity playstyle, so there's that. Nevertheless, run 2. Their other synchro is Old Entity CThugha, obviously based off of CThugha, not Cthulhu, that's something else entirely. He's a level 4 Fire Pyro type with 2200 attack and 200 defense. What synergy! He's completely generic, just like Hastur, and has the following effect. If this card is synchro summoned, you can return all rank 4 Xyz monsters on the field to the extra deck. If you fusion summon using this card as fusion material, draw one card. An Xyz monster that was summoned using this card as material gains this effect. If it is Xyz summoned, draw one card. This is an effect for a cheap throwaway main deck monster, not an extra deck monster you have to devote additional resources to bring out before even using more resources to use. The Xyz bouncing effect is something that might have been relevant at the time of its release when Xyz toolboxing was still a common enough practice, but now has all the intimidation factor of a fart in the wind. The only relevant use I can think of for this would be to recycle some of the deck's own Xyz monsters to use again, which is actually a stupid game plan if you're using it for that purpose. The one card draw effect if this thing is used as fusion or Xyz material is okay, but after the hard minus you went into just to make the damn thing in the first place, you probably would have been better off using those resources for something else in the first place. Don't run it. Their first Xyz monster is Outer Entity Nyarla. Well, that's a face only a mother could beat. His design comes from this ugly hellspawn whose name I'm not even going to attempt to pronounce because I value my sanity points too much. He's a rank 4 Earth Fiend with 0 attack and 2600 defense. He requires 2 level 4s and has the following effect. When this card is Xyz summoned, you can discard any number of cards, increase this card's rank by 1 for each card discarded. Once per turn, if this card has Xyz material, you can target one monster in your graveyard, detach all materials from this card, and if you do, attach that monster to this card's material, and if you do that, this card's type and attribute become that material's original type and attribute. Honestly, the best part of this thing is the defense value. The confusing combination of effects completely out of left field, those being the rank manipulation and the type attribute changing, have no practical application whatsoever other than convoluted rank-up shenanigans. But even for that, it's completely useless in that regard, as you would need to discard at least 4 cards to be able to rank up into anything worthwhile. Not even Danger Dark Worlds can afford that much discarding after investing resources into making a rank 4 Xyz, and that's their entire MO! This doesn't make sense on so many levels, especially given the fact that Nyarla What's-His-Face is supposed to be one of the strongest and most feared of the Outer Guard, second only to the one we'll be getting into later. The fact that such an important character is given such an absurdly useless effect is just further proof that Konami just didn't bother giving 2 tits of a rat's ass about this archetype or the source material and just half-assed their way through designing them just long enough to shit out enough pack filler trash for no goddamn reason! As you can no doubt tell, I'm none too pleased when adapters needlessly shit on their source material like this. Regardless, you run one of these things not because you want to, but because you have to. Their last monster is the final boss monster, Outer Entity Azathoth.
Be gone, Thought!
He's obviously based on Azathoth, the leader and most feared of the Outer Gods, and fun fact is also known as the Blind Idiot God.
What are you?
An idiot sandwich.
He's a rank 5 Dark Fiend with 2400 attack and 0 defense. He requires 3 level 5s, but can also be Xyz summoned by using an outer entity monster you control as material. How vaguely specific. Cannot be used as material for an Xyz summoned, and after this card was Xyz summoned, your opponent cannot activate monster effects for the rest of that turn. If this card is at least 3 Xyz materials, 1 fusion, 1 synchro, and 1 Xyz monster, you can detach 1 material from this card, destroy all cards your opponent controls. And there you have it, the sole excuse this archetype has for trying to forcefully shove all 3 of its distinct playstyles into one, no matter how convoluted it may be. Look, I like a good field nuke as much as the next guy, especially ones which don't affect my field, but this is just an absurdly ridiculous and inconsistent way of setting it up that it rarely ever pays off in the end. The idea of this card being a combination of fusion, synchro, and Xyz monsters is fitting to the theme, and was a lot easier to pull off when the archetype was first conceived. You needed to summon Norden, either by fusion or other means, use his effect to revive a Hastur or CThugha that was sent to the graveyard earlier, then overlay them both into Nyarla, and then immediately rank up into Azathoth to give him the materials required to pull off his nuke effect. But Norden is banned, so you can't do that. Ugh! To add insult to injury, you have to bend over backwards and do a tap dance atop a table of burning spikes to be able to pull off the nuke effect more than once, because by detaching materials to activate, he no longer meets the required conditions to be able to use said effect, so you have to run further engines to either place more materials underneath him to detach, or find a way to bypass detaching altogether. If you're not planning to dedicate your whole deck around setting up that effect, then he is still serviceable enough due to that stun effect, and so he's playing a lot of control decks nowadays due to the PK Rum card being able to so easily summon him off of Time Thief Redoer during the opponent's turn to halt their plays cold in most cases. Either way, he's still the only thing entities have that even remotely resembles a win condition, or any condition whatsoever for that matter, so you'll want to make sure to run him at 1 or 2. Their first spell card is the aforementioned single direct support card of the archetype, Forbidden Trapezohedron. It's a normal spell with a massive wall of text that boils down to a very simple effect. If you control exactly 2 monster card types among Fusion, Synchro, and or Xyz, special summon an entity monster from your extra deck that's of a different card type from those you currently control. If summoning an outer entity monster this way, attach this card to it as material. You can only activate 1 Forbidden Trapezohedron per turn. Maybe while Norden was legal at 3 and before the tyranny of the Link era, I could kinda see running this at 1, but as of right now it's all but completely useless. With Norden gone, there's no longer an Eldar entity target for this to go into, since Natis can only be summoned through contact fusion. Shortcutting Nyarla won't do anybody any good whatsoever, and any use of summoning Azathoth off this is rendered irrelevant due to it not being a quick play. I can kinda see how getting a shortcut to Hastur and CThugha sounds good in theory, but the biggest downfall of that strategy is that none of these effects are a proper summon, so you can't revive the monster once you use them as material. You know, the thing you're supposed to be doing with these monsters in the first place. Not to mention the setup required of pulling off this card's conditions and having a linked zone available to use this card nowadays is virtually impossible for any deck other than Pendulum Magicians, and they really can't afford the space in the extra deck to make room for any of the entities. Long story short, don't run this. Their field spell is Dreamland, and it gains the following effects based on the monster card types on the field. Fusion. Once per turn, if a monster is sent from your hand or field to the graveyard by a card effect, except during the damage step, you can draw one card. Synchro. When a monster is normal or special summoned, except during the damage step, you can increase their levels by 1. And Exceed. Once per turn during your end phase, destroy the monsters on the field with the highest level. You can only activate one Dreamland per turn. Joining the ranks of Power the Guardians and BLS the Chaos Warrior, here we have yet another card that is perfectly serviceable, but useless in its own archetype. In this case, this is actually due to the huge disparity between its 3 different effects. The fusion effect is literally just a +1, presumably to make up for the inherent minus that fusion summoning has, and I can see this being run in Shadal's or Metal Foes as a nifty draw engine. It certainly gives their own field spells a run for their money. The synchro effect is cute, but any decks that require level manipulation already have access to that themselves, and that one extra level could end up harming your plays as well. Still, it's the controller of this card that decides when to activate, and since it affects both sides of the field, it could potentially screw over some decks that require exact level numbers. However, I'm finding a real tough time trying to figure out why they decided to make the Exceed effect mandatory. Sure, your Exceed monsters are safe from destruction, and Link monsters couldn't care less either, but if the person who just so happens to be controlling the monsters with the highest levels is you, and you activate this, all you did is just go into a big minus because you went and destroyed your own monsters for no goddamn reason. Furthermore, as mentioned earlier, Link monsters can't be destroyed, so if you're going against something like, say, Gokis for example, this card isn't exactly going to do anything relevant to save your ass whatsoever. And since the only monster that the entities want to leave on the field is Sothoth, they're essentially going to be shooting themselves in the foot a lot if they try to use this. Feel free to experiment with this card, but don't use it if you plan on making any Exceed monsters whatsoever. Their last card is the normal trap card Forbidden Apocrypha. Declare one extra deck monster card type, Fusion, Synchro, or Exceed. If 2 or more monsters of the declared type are on the field, make each player send all monsters of that type from their field to the graveyard. I know that sounds like a good side option against some decks that really focus heavily on one of those types of cards, and it is. However, that's about all it's good for. Mass, non-targeting, non-destruction removal is a good option, but as of right now, the requirements of pulling it off are way too costly and not likely enough of a scenario to run with any sort of certainty. It does count both sides of the field, so if your opponent has one problematic card, you can summon one of your own to get rid of it, but that's such a painfully stupid game plan that it never actually pays off in the long run. To top it off, it's a trap card, so even if you do get the chance to pull it off, you still have to wait a turn and hope that your opponent either doesn't get rid of it, get rid of their monsters, or simply doesn't OTK you after resolving it. Like I said, it's a good side option, but not something you actively want to run. And now we come to the diagnosis part of the video, and this one's going to be kind of tricky. How can we possibly improve on an archetype such as entities? Hey, here's an idea, why not make an actual deck out of these things? The idea of combining Fusion, Synchro, and Exceed monsters is genuinely cool and appealing, but without a consistent archetypal way of doing so, there's no way to do so even fractionally as consistent as it needs to be. It's not like they ran out of ideas for the archetype either, they just stopped giving a shit. The Cthulhu mythos is a vast realm of creative and interesting characters, creatures, and elements, and you're just going to ignore 98% of it? And on top of that, the 2% you do end up using just end up being inconsistently mishandled boss monsters to boot? Speaking of boss monsters, they need to be a much better win condition. One monster with a decent stun effect and a great, if consistent, nuke effect is not going to win anything on its own. Perhaps old and Eldar entity boss monsters on par with Sothoth should be the way to go here? This is where I would usually list 2 or 3 other problems with the deck, but the lack of anything tangible in entities leaves me unclear with what exactly their playstyle is supposed to be, or how it works, especially in Master Rule 4, where multiple extra deck summonings are near impossible to pull off without additional setup. Here's a frog deck of all things that can occasionally shit out a full-powered thought on demand. Really anything will work here as long as it can make a link monster and shit out a level 4 synchro when needed. So now we come to the part of the video that you've either been looking forward to due to the vast potential, or dreading due to this video's obnoxious length. That being the prescription. Surprisingly enough, I'm going to have to prolong the new support a little longer, because before we get into that, we have to address the issue with Norden. As of right now, the deck is completely dependent on him, so having him on the forbidden list is a huge problem. Therefore, we need to errata him to get him off of the list before he can get into the new support. After some deliberation, I eventually settled on giving him a requirement of being first fusion summoned with his fusion materials, and making the effect a hard once per turn. It makes it much less splashable, much less broken, yet still generic enough to use in just about any deck. If you're worried about getting its materials together for a proper fusion summon, don't worry, we'll address that with the new support later. And now we can start with the new support, but before we can get into the monster lineup, we have to address the natural disadvantages associated with Master Rule 4. If I just make the main deck with an emphasis on spamming the field with monsters, it'll just end up as another link spam deck with nothing to recommend using it for its intended purposes. But if I restrict link summoning, which I absolutely did because fuck it, then we're left with the problem of having only room for one extra deck monster at a time and no logical way of using them in tandem. Therefore, they need an archetypal way of getting around this natural weakness for the deck. In keeping with the splashability theme of the original set, I came up with this group I like to call the Insignia Spell lineup. Insignia of Norden, Hastur, and Jarla are a trio of continuous spell cards designed specifically for this purpose. Why a trio? Because their effects are all similar in how they work, yet clearly separated despite inherently working together. While you control an insert entity sub-archetype here in the extra monster zone, you can perform their respective extra deck summon into any unoccupied main monster zone. You can shuffle this face-up card into the deck, activate the next card in the lineup from your deck, but it cannot activate its effects this turn. When I say it cannot activate its effects, I mean the effect to search and activate the next in line cannot be used, so it can't be used to activate them over and over again to facilitate more Exodia FTKs. But since the extra deck unlocking effect is not considered an activated effect, it can still be active even after being searched out by another Insignia. This allows for more options both in the deck and in other decks that got fucked over by Master Rule 4. This is further helped by the normal spell Call of Cthulhu. If you control a face-up Insignia continuous spell card, special summon one entity monster from your extra deck, ignoring its summoning conditions. It cannot attack, its effects are negated, also shuffle it into the extra deck during the end phase. You can only activate one Call of Cthulhu per turn. This enables the Insignia set by providing them with a temporary entity monster to fulfill their conditions to allow you to go full Quasar spam just like in the good old days. It also does wonders for the entities themselves by providing materials for their boss monsters, be it Sothoth or one of the new ones we'll get into later. Either way, it's a good engine for any deck that focuses on fusion, synchro, and Oryx summoning. That is, until Master Rule 5 comes around to make this and literally every other Link-era support card completely useless. Well, I can't put it off any longer, so I guess it's time to start on the main deck monsters. Listen, there's no logical way to facilitate 3 different types of extra deck summonings with only a handful of cards, and like I've said before, the Cthulhu mythos is a huge untapped vein of potential, so I can't even narrow it down in that regard. Thus, after what I can legally define as years of doing what I can technically call extensive research, I've come up with a few ideas for how to make them work so that you can build an actual deck out of them. Feel free to make your own version out of these. Mind you, this does have the unfortunate downside of there being way more of them than I would like for the purposes of this video, so I'm just going to go ahead and blast through most of these as quickly as I possibly can and cover any outliers that stand out as being more interesting afterwards. Other Entity Byakuya is a level 2 dark zombie that can special summon itself from the graveyard if you control an entity monster at a hard once per turn. Simple, reusable resource generation is never something to scoff at, and this card is perfectly serviceable as such. Other Entity Chthonian is a level 2 earth insect that once per turn lets you summon up to 2 copies of itself from the deck or graveyard when it's summoned, but it cannot be used as link material. Monster spamming and deck thinning for easy swarming and plays. Other Entity Loigor is a level 2 dark dinosaur tuner that when sent for the field or graveyard lets you target and bounce an opponent's card. Simple, non-destruction spot removal that can help you out if a pinch is needed. Other Entity Migo is a level 4 dark plant that gives off an effect to an Xyz monster that uses a material to negate the effects of your opponent's face-up spells and traps with the cost of detaching an Xyz material or taking 1,000 burn damage during the end phase. A bit specific, but offers a few interesting plays and gives more splashability to the deck. Other Entity Night Gaunt is a level 4 dark winged beast that lets you fusion summon an Eldar entity monster by using material from your hand or graveyard. If this card is used as fusion material, you can recycle an entity monster to your graveyard except itself. Fusion enabling and recovery both for the engines and the extra deck monsters themselves. Other Entity Servitor is a level 4 dark fiend that lets you banish it from the graveyard and place a detaching Xyz material from an outer entity monster. Once per turn, you can special summon this card from the graveyard if you control an outer entity monster, and if it's special summoned, you can special summon another copy of itself from the hand or deck. Easy swarming and recyclability, but the graveyard banishing effect is far better for bypassing what would otherwise be difficult costs. Other Entity Shantak is a level 4 wind reptile that lets you special summon itself and another entity monster from your graveyard if it's used as fusion material, but you cannot summon monsters from the extra deck except for entities. Sure, it needs an insignia to be useful, but it's a +2 that makes up for the minus fusion summoning, so it gets a pass. Other Entity Shoggoth is a level 8 dark aqua tuner that lets you special summon itself from the hand if you control a non-tuner entity monster, and copies the level of an entity monster when summoned this way. A simple versatile tuner that instantly summons itself, it's nothing to sneeze at for synchro plays. Other Entity Tagwa is a level 2 fire zombie tuner that when used for a synchro summon of an old entity monster, you can banish this card from your graveyard and one card your opponent controls. Non-targeting, non-destructive removal of any problem monster. Other Entity Vine is a level 4 fire rock that you can special summon from your hand if you control an old entity monster. If it leaves the field due to an opposed card while you control an old entity monster, banish all monsters on field except old entity monsters. Same thing as before, but bigger and more difficult to pull off consistently and safely. And Other Entity Zug is a level 2 dark beast tuner that when summoned searches a poly or fusion spell from your deck or graveyard. You can target one other monster you control and change its level to match this card, but you can't summon from the extra deck except for entities. It's a dark monster that searches super poly and enables synchro and Xyz plays. I don't know what else you need. I feel like I need to reiterate that I don't actually think any of these cards are going to be printed. I'm just coming up with as many options as I can in the hopes that some of them might be made as kind of a monkeys and typewriter strategy. Also, for the record, I must admit I'm not much of a fan for making the main deck just a tool for accessing the extra with nothing to recommend on its own merits, but for the most part I didn't have much of a choice this time. Sadly, after, 11 monsters in the main deck, we've still got a few more to go before we get to the extra. However, for the sake of making things a little interesting, I tried to get a little creative with these ones. Other Entity Zirn is a level 6 dark rock monster with 2300 attack and 1000 defense, and an interesting artifact-like effect. You can set this card from your hand to your spell and trap card zone. If this card is destroyed while in the spell trap zone, you can special summon this card from your graveyard. If summoned this way, place as many monsters on the field as possible face up in their controller's spell trap zones, except this card. You can send one monster in a spell and trap card zone to the graveyard, inflict damage to your opponent equal to half of the original attack of the sent monster. You can only use each effect of Other Entity Zirn once per turn. It's an interesting method of removal, given how it's not only non-targeting and non-destruction, but it doesn't even remove from the field, so it also dodges floating effects as well as most forms of protection, and can even clog up the opponent's back row if you get enough of them. Additionally, the effect to send monsters from the spell and trap zone to the graveyard isn't even limited to the ones that are put there by itself, so it can be a counter against some decks that put their own monsters there. It does affect your field too, so that can kinda be a double-edged sword, but it also gives you options to use the burn damage from your own monsters if you manage to clog up the opponent's entire back row, and you don't want to end up freeing up space for them. It's not much for entity support on its own, but still offers a few creative techs and deck building. The last of the regular monsters is the great Other Entity Magnum Innominatium. It's a huge level 12 Dark Fiend with an effect that would make most kaijus shit their pants. Cannot be normal summoned or set. Must be special summoned to the opponent's side of the field by tributing all monsters they control, minimum 1. This card's original attack and defense is equal to the number of monsters tributed for this card's summon times 1000. This card cannot attack or be tributed, cannot be destroyed by battle, and is unaffected by other card effects. Now the last effect obviously applies to the opponent while they are in control of it. During your opponent's standby phase, you can pay life points equal to half this card's attack, Monsters your opponent currently controls are changed to attack position. Also, all monsters your opponent controls must attack this card this turn if able. Like the monster who must not be named it's based on, this is an incredibly dangerous creature, even to the one who summoned it. You can't pick and choose monsters to tribute since it's an all-or-nothing deal. Thus, if you end up tributing 3 or more monsters, which is going to be often since it's considered bricking if you end with any less than that, you just gave your opponent a potentially huge wall that's virtually immune to almost all effects and battle destruction. It cannot itself attack, but it does have an effect that can force you to attack it on the next turn at the cost of some life points. Which, considering you're going to be smacking into a potentially huge beater and losing a lot of monsters and life points yourself, isn't going to be much of a problem for them to do so. Even tributing just one monster is risky since it's still borderline invincible, so if you don't go for the OTK, you're going to have a hard time getting around it without piercing damage. Still though, it's mass, non-targeting, non-destruction tribute removal, so it's bound to see at least some play in today's current metagame. Okay, so some of you who are familiar with the Cthulhu mythos may be wondering at this point, but PT, you missed one of the biggest groups of monsters that are neither Elder Gods, Outer Gods, nor Great Old Ones. Well, that's where you're wrong. I didn't forget about them, but since they're defined by an entirely unique classification separate from the others, I decided to do something a little different with them. Deep Entity Hydra is a level 4 water sea serpent ritual monster with 2000 attack and 1200 defense, and you can ritual summon this card with Shadows of Ralia. You can tribute this ritual summoned card, add 1 Deep Entity monster from your deck to your hand except Deep Entity Hydra, then you can add 1 ritual spell card from your graveyard to your hand. You can only use this effect of Deep Entity Hydra once per turn. If this card is sent from the field to the graveyard, you can special summon 1 entity monster from your graveyard. You cannot summon other monsters the turn you use this effect, except entity monsters. Shadows of Ralia lets you ritual summon any deep entity monster from your hand or graveyard by tributing monsters from your hand or field whose levels exactly equal the level of the monster you summon. If an entity monster would be destroyed by your opponent's card, you can banish this card from the graveyard instead. I don't think I need to explain why this is a good effect. It both searches the other member of its sub-archetype while simultaneously recycling the ritual spell for immediate use. But of course the real meat is obviously the second effect to revive any entity monster, including itself when it gets sent to the graveyard by any means, whether it was destroyed or used material, and it's not even limited to a once per turn, hard or otherwise. It forces the user into the archetype in a very, very restrictive way, but that's understandable because this amount of excessive recursion would be downright disgusting if it could be abused by every archetype under the sun. Or under the sea, whatever. Nevertheless, it's an incredibly useful resource generator for the deck and works as an incredibly helpful secondary boss monster alongside his partner. Deep Entity Dagon is a level 8 ritual monster with the same type and attribute as Hydra. He's got 3000 attack and 2000 defense, and you can ritual summon this card with Shadows of Ralia. While you control a Deep Entity monster other than this one, this card cannot be targeted or destroyed by your opponent's card effects. If an entity monster is special summoned from the graveyard, you can draw 1 card, then discard 1 card. You can only use this effect of Deep Entity Dagon once per turn. While this seems like a good final boss monster, needless to say there's an even better one coming later, and I think you know who it's gonna be. Nevertheless, it's a good alternative since it's much easier to get him out at full power since Hydra can fuel his protection effect while constantly reviving herself to continue protecting him. Furthermore, he acts as a deck thinner since he lets you draw and discard each time Hydra comes back from the graveyard, so he helps up to set up the deck's actual win condition as well. Feel free to give him a try. And now we finally come to the extra deck, the one place where entities are supposed to shine. Since they desperately need a bigger toolbox and to allow the sub-archetypes a chance to potentially stand out on their own, I went ahead and made a few options for each of them to add on to the existing ones. Again, I leave you to decide on the build you wish to make of these yourself. Well, since the outer entities already have their boss monster, we may as well start with them. You start off with Outer Entity Althaea, based on the Outer God Althaea, who has a few different appearances and origins, but have a common theme of symbolizing truth and mind control. She's a rank 2 Light Fiend Tuner, the first of her kind. She has 0 attack and 2100 defense. She requires 2 level 2s with different types, and has the following effect. You can use this card as synchro material for a synchro summon by using this card's rank as if it were a level. During your main phase, you can increase this card's rank by the combined levels of the Xyz materials underneath it. You can detach one Xyz material from this card, target one monster your opponent controls, and take control of it. It cannot attack, and its effects are negated. If this card has no Xyz materials, destroy this card. You can only Xyz summon and use each effect of Outer Entity Althaea once per turn. The first effect was the only one that actually needed to be there due to decay mechanics, for obvious reasons. The control effect is actually based on her ability to take control of others using her wire-like protrusions by replacing their spinal bone in a puppet-like fashion. Creepy, but a loyal adaptation nonetheless. The rank manipulation is mostly to help make use of any monsters stolen from the opponent for synchro summoning if their levels aren't immediately useful. Ultimately, her effect came down to there needing to be an Xyz tuner, and she just so happened to be both fitting and available to the role. Next up is Outer Entity Lukthu, based off of Lukthu, the father of the Great Old Ones, who gives life to their larval forms through the multiple pus-filled cysts on his damp and tangled external entrails. That's actually disgusting. I'm not even making this shit up. Anyway, he's a rank 4 Dark Fiend with 0 attack and 2500 defense. He requires 2 level 4 entities and has the following effect. If this card is Xyz summoned, you can target one monster you control, return that target to the hand, then move this card you control to that monster's monster zone. You can detach one Xyz material from this card, special summon one level 4 Old Entity monster from your extra deck. It cannot attack, and its effects are negated. Also, for the rest of this turn, you cannot special summon monsters from the extra deck except entity monsters. You can only use each effect of Outer Entity Lukthu once per turn. In keeping with the theme of his origin, Lukthu is basically a resource generator that brings out an old entity for use as material along with himself. Particularly useful as fusion material because the new fusion spell makes getting into the Elder Entity boss monster significantly easier with this. Just try not to think too deeply about it. Next is Outer Entity Savoir, based on Ubo Savoir, a protoplasmic math that continuously spawns prototypal versions of all life forms on Earth. He's a rank 4 water with 2200 attack and 0 defense, requires 2 level 4s, and has the following effect. If this card is Xyz summoned, you can special summon one level 4 or lower entity monster from your deck. You can detach all Xyz monsters from this card. This turn, if you would fusion summon a monster, you can use one face-up monster your opponent controls as fusion material. You can only use each effect of Outer Entity Savoir once per turn. Same thing as the last monster, though with fewer options available to them, as well as depending on the opponent to make their plays. It'll probably still be seeing as much, if not more, play than Lukthu, but I feel like it's balanced somewhat by it being a little more inconsistent than his brother. Next we have Outer Entity Shubnig, based off of the racist goat of the early 20th century with 1,000 racial slurs, Shubnig. There seems to be a bit of debate on whether she's supposed to be a Great Old One or an Outer God, though the majority seems to point toward the latter, so here she is. She's a rank 2 Wind with 2000 attack and 0 defense, requires 2 or more level 2s, and you can only control one Outer Entity Shubnig. While you control an entity monster other than this card, your opponent cannot target this card for attacks or card effects. You can detach one Xyz material from this card, special summon a number of level 4 or lower entity monsters from your deck with different names equal to the number of Xyz materials currently attached to this card. You can only use this effect of Other Entity Shubnig once per turn. There's no restriction on link summoning this time, but the restriction of the swarming effect specifically to entities still accomplishes the same effect in essence. I'm sure there'll still be some of you who try to make a link spam variant with this, but if that happens, then it was due to several oversights on multiple cards, not just this one. Nevertheless, it's still a good swarming tool for a deck that's embarrassingly desperate for as much of it as it can get. The last Outer Entity is the one based off of Sothoth, aptly named Outer Entity Sothoth.
Be gone, Thought!
It's a rank 4 fire with 2300 attack and 0 defense. It requires 3 level 4s, and during your standby phase, detach 1 Xyz material from this card. While this card has no Xyz materials, this card's effect on the field are negated. Your opponent cannot target this card for attacks or with card effects. During your main phase, you can normal summon 1 entity monster in addition to your normal summoner set. If this card is destroyed by your opponent's card by battle or card effect, banish all monsters on the field. Again, I don't think I need to explain why a targeting immune archetypal Seraphonite is a good card. However, in keeping with the dangerous and volatile nature of the source material, I added the field nuke effect to discourage leaving it on the field too long. Plus, it requires 3 materials, so it's a bit trickier to get out as opposed to other outer entity monsters. Still though, there's enough general swarming potential to allow for this kind of extension in the deck, so feel free to experiment with him. Now we move on to the Elder Gods, starting off with Elder Entity Bastet, based off the Egyptian goddess Bast, who is an Elder God for some reason? Listen, I'll gladly take this over more of this shit. Anyway, she's a level 4 Earth Fairy with 2300 attack and 700 defense. She requires 2 monsters with different types and has the following effect. This card's fusion summon cannot be negated. If this card is special summoned, you can target 1 card on each side of the field, return them to the hand. If this card leaves the field, you can target 1 polymerization spell or fusion spell card in your graveyard, add it to your hand. You can only use each effect of Elder Entity Bastet once per turn. Simple, easy removal with a moderate amount of recovery. By bouncing herself with her own effect, she can recycle a fusion card, most likely the one used to get her on the field in the first place, which can be used to summon her again in the next turn. Additionally, she can clear up an extra monster zone for use with another monster type to more effectively use the insignia to fill your board. Now asking the real question, which one of these is going to see the ban list next? Instant Fusion or Super Poly? Elder Entity Thanid is the next card, and he is based off of Cathanid, who is the twin brother of Cthulhu, who is a great old one. And this is an Elder God. Moving on. He's a level 4 Dark with 1800 attack and 2500 defense. He requires 2 entities and material and has the following effect. If this card is special summoned while you control no other monsters, you can target 1 old entity monster in your graveyard, special summon that target, then immediately special summon 1 rank 4 or lower outer entity monster from your extra deck by using the targeted monster and this card as material. This is treated as an Xyz summon. You can only use this effect of Elder Entity Thanid once per turn. This is basically a button for getting out a full-powered Azathoth, and also helps to serve as a potential replacement for Norden if he never receives this errata. It requires a bit of setup, but fortunately the fusion spell we'll get into later helps out to a degree, so it's still a lot easier to get him out when he needs to be. Next up is Elder Entity Vorva, based off of Vorvados, who is a son of Nodens and one of the Great Old Ones. Jesus Christ, and I thought Zeus was a sick fuck. He's a level 4 Fire Tuner with 2400 attack and 200 defense. Requires 2 monsters that were special summoned from the extra deck as material, and has the following effect. If this card is special summoned, you can target 1 monster your opponent controls and destroy it. You can only use this effect of Elder Entity Vorva once per turn. If this card is sent from the field to the graveyard, you can special summon 1 Elder Entity Ditha from your extra deck or graveyard, but you cannot link summon for the rest of this turn. Also, your opponent takes no further effect damage this turn. Interesting. What does this Ditha do? Well, here he is. He's based off of Yagdatha, who is, somehow, the twin brother of Vorvados. Personally, I feel like Vorva got all the looks in the family. He's a Wind Tuner with the inverse stats as his brother, and he has the exact same effect, only for spells and traps, and summoning Vorva instead. While these two do have the ability to summon each other from the extra deck, due to it not being a proper fusion summon, they can't be revived if they get sent to the graveyard, so you'll have to be careful about that. Ideally, you'll want to try and fusion summon them both, then keep switching between them, Sun and Moon Dragon style. The revival effect isn't once per turn, but fortunately I had the foresight to prevent any bullshit Cannon Soldier FTKs with the burn prevention, which can also serve as some sort of punishment depending on the deck you guys splashed these into. The last fusion monster is Eldar entity Oryx. I get the feeling that Lovecraft was kind of phoning it in with some of these Elder Gods designs. It should also be noted that Oryx isn't the leader of the Elder Gods, just one of the more powerful ones. Now that I think of it, that would have made so much more sense. Why didn't I go with the leader of the Elder Gods for their boss monster? Oh, that's right, Konami already blew that load. Sometimes it's days like this that make me regret I ever hitched my wagon to such an incompetent card game. Well, anyway, he's a level 11 light with 2900 attack and 3300 defense. He requires 3 monsters with different names as a material, must first be fusion summoned by using monsters owned by you as material. If this card is fusion summoned, your opponent cannot activate spell effects for the rest of this turn. If this card is fusion summoned by using 1 fusion monster, 1 synchro monster, and 1 Xyz monster as materials, it gains the following effects. Your opponent can only special summon monsters once per turn, and your opponent can only activate 1 spell or trap card per turn. It's like if Great Shogun Shien and Summon Limit had a baby, and that baby happened to be a giant pillar of bright purple light for some reason, because... Nevertheless, it's a fantastic stun card when summoned properly, especially since their archetypal fusion spell makes summoning him properly much easier. Even if he doesn't get summoned properly, he does have a stun effect on par with that of Azathoth, which allows him to stall out any spell-heavy decks and prevent them from building a board if summoning during the opponent's turn via Flash Fusion or Super Poly. Although speaking of Super Poly, that's basically the reason for the restriction of only using monsters owned by you as material, since it would otherwise just result in turning Super Poly into a spell speed 4 plus 2. And nobody wants to see that, isn't that right, Trishula, Dragon of Icy Imprisonment? Nevertheless, if you're a Fusion fan, Oryx Turbo builds might be a fun way to go and screw with a lot of players. And now we get back to the old entities, the great old ones, the creatures that really make you step back and think. Mostly you think, what the fuck did I just read? We start off with old entity Kaeya, based off of Kaeya, a comparatively simple design for a great old one, though still kind of falls in the category of hideous hellspawn never to see the light of day. He's a level 4 Earth Aqua with 2100 attack and 2600 defense, requires any tuner and any non-tuner monsters, and has the following effect. If this card is summoned, you can shuffle 1 card your opponent controls into the deck. You must control another face-up entity monster to activate and resolve this effect. If an entity monster is summoned while this card is in the graveyard, target 1 monster on the field and destroy it. You can only use each effect of old entity Kaeya once per turn. With the low-level old entities, you don't really care about their effects much since you're going to be using them as materials anyways. In this case, the first effect happens on summon for simple non-targeting, non-destruction, spinning removal, and that's it. But the real meat comes from the graveyard effect. Simply having this card in the graveyard means that you have a free pop on demand by simply summoning a monster once per turn. It both targets and destroys, unlike the first effect, but given that the activation requirements are a lot simpler and easier to pull off, that's kind of warranted in this case. It's certainly going to be interesting to deal with if your opponent doesn't have immediate access to Called by the Grave, so running one of these is a good idea as far as the generic old entity material, regardless of the build. Next up is old entity Gadanoa, based off of Medusa's weird cousin, Gatanathoa. He's a level 6 light rock with 1900 attack and 2900 defense. It requires 1 entity tuner and any non-tuner monsters and has an interesting effect. Negate the effects of all face-up monsters on the field except this one. If a monster other than this card would be destroyed by battle, it is not destroyed. During the end phase of the turn this effect was applied, shuffle all monsters that would have been destroyed by battle into the deck, and inflict damage to their controllers equal to half the combined original attack of their monsters shuffled into the deck. You can only control 1 old entity Gadanoa. Those of you familiar with these creatures may notice I like to try and incorporate the abilities of these creatures into their effects. In this case, the effect is based off of Gatanathoa's ability to petrify everything near it, but not actually killing them. Rather, their souls are trapped within their now mummified brains, which are fully alive and cognizant, but unable to move or even communicate in any way. The only way to actually free them is to destroy their brains and kill them. Honestly, that's terrifying to think about, but at least it makes for an interesting control effect as kind of a secondary boss monster to play around with. Now this hideous hellspawn is Old Entity Thugha, not Tagwa, but Sothoth, the ugly toad bat sloth thing. Love being specific. It's a level 4 Dark Beast tuner with 500 attack and 2600 defense. It's completely generic as well, and has the following effect. You can target one monster on the field, special summon one spawn token, a Dark level 2 fiend with 0 defense to your side of the field, with attack equal to that of the targeted monster, but it cannot be used as material. You can tribute any number of spawn tokens you control, send a number of cards from your opponent's hand to the graveyard equal to the number of tributed tokens. You can only use each effect of Old Entity Thugha once per turn. With the main ability of Sothoth being able to create formless spawn creatures, there had to be some sort of token generation effect on the card somewhere, but I didn't want it to be yet another link spam engine, so I decided to give them a new utility in exchange for disallowing them from being used as material. It also feeds, no pun intended, to the idea of the incredibly gluttonous nature of this creature, so it also gets bonus points for that. Plus it's a synchro tuner and there had to be at least one of them, so here we are. Next up is Old Entity Yig, based off the father of Snek himself. He's a level 4 water reptile with 2200 attack and 1500 defense, is completely generic, and has the following effect. If this card is summoned, you can add one polymerization spell or fusion spell card from your deck or graveyard to your hand. If this card is used as fusion material, special summon this card from the graveyard, but you cannot link summon for the rest of this turn. You can only use each effect of Old Entity Yig once per turn. It's basically a button for getting into one of the 3 boss monsters, particularly when used in conjunction with Thanid or Lukthu. Not much else to say here other than it's a good engine to work with. Plus it's also a tuner which helps open the way to the entity's own boss monster, and I think you know who it is. Old Entity Cthulhu, and I don't think I need to explain which Cthulhu mythos creature he's based on, is a level 12 water dragon with 3400 attack and 3100 defense. It requires 1 tuner and 2 non-tuner monsters, and you can use face-up Xyz monsters as materials for this card's Synchro Summon by using their ranks as if they were levels. This card's Synchro Summon cannot be negated. If this card is Synchro Summoned by using 1 fusion monster, 1 synchro monster, and 1 Xyz monster as materials, it gains the following effect. Entity monsters and Insignia continuous spell cards you control cannot be targeted by, and are unaffected by, your opponent's card effects. And with that, we have the 3 builds for entities lined up neatly for everyone, those being Azathoth OTK, Oryx Control, and now Cthulhu Turbo. Not only is he unaffected by opponent's card effects when summoned properly, but he also cannot be targeted by them, and extends the same protection to all entity monsters and even the Insignia as well. He's a bit trickier to bring out at full power than the other 3, given how there's no easy method to do so than there is for the other 2, but with enough setup you can still make him fairly easily enough. Still, the inherent difficulty of summoning him over the others allowed for him to be much stronger in terms of his effects, which is also why he lacks the stun effects of the other 2. That and the only thing left to stun are traps, and given how naturally slower they are in general makes them not worth trying to counter in the first place, especially since there's no easy way to synchro summon during the opponent's turn outside of Crystron's. Nevertheless, it's a great boss monster for synchro players, and definitely worth building an entire deck around. Oh my god, I can almost see the end. Just 3 more cards to go, and I can finally put this video to bed. I wish I could say that was the end of the monsters, but I know some of you purists aren't gonna like the idea of the Insignia cards. So to accommodate those of you who prefer their decks to be more traditional, I'll give you this one. Other Entity Feral is a Link 3 Dark Fiend with 3000 attack, has perfect link arrow arrangements, i.e. all down arrows. It requires 3 monsters summoned from the extra deck, and has the following effect. You cannot link summon. This effect cannot be negated. During your main phase, you can special summon up to 2 entity monsters in your graveyard to a zone this card points to, but they cannot attack, their effects are negated, also banish them during the end phase. You can only use this effect of Other Entity Feral once per turn. While this card points to a fusion monster, a synchro monster, and an Xyz monster, double the attack of all entity monsters you control, also they inflict piercing damage. I'm not gonna lie, I don't like this guy. It just reeks of desperation and forcing the deck to work in a very convoluted way, but it's the only way I could incorporate the entity's playstyle into a Link monster. The attack doubling and piercing effect is nice, but by the time you're able to fulfill the conditions for it, it just ends up being more of a win more card. Still, for those of you who absolutely refuse to give up on Link summoning monsters in a deck that clearly wasn't designed for them, feel free to make a deck around this one if you want. The often remarked fusion spell is unsurprisingly called Eldar Entity Fusion. The first effect is literally just an archetypal polymerization, with the additional benefit of letting you use one monster from your extra deck if you use at least one entity monster you control as material. Also, during your end phase, you can shuffle one entity monster in your graveyard into the deck to add this card from your graveyard to the hand. You can only activate one Eldar Entity Fusion per turn. I strongly believe that anyone with an IQ greater than, say, 30 probably saw this one coming, but given how useful and necessary it is for the deck, I'm willing to err on the side of predictability with this one. To prevent its abuse in the deck, I limited the activation to a hard once per turn, but allowed for it to be recycled for the next turn by simultaneously recycling an entity to the deck, which is most likely the monster you dumped on the initial fusion summon. If you're running the Eldar Entity variant, or just plan on making Eldar entities at all, make sure you run a copy or two. And the last card is the continuous spell Order of Dagon. If an entity monster would leave the field, you can shuffle it into the deck instead. If you control an entity monster, you can special summon one entity monster from your hand. You can only use this effect of Order of Dagon once per turn. The Samsara-like effect of spinning monsters into the deck seems a bit outdated and inefficient, but you'd be surprised of how useful it can be with recycling the smaller extra deck monsters. It also helps to build up a field for going into said smaller extra deck monsters so you can work toward your main win conditions, whatever that condition may be, even if said win conditions happens to be Feral Beatdown, although please don't build Feral Beatdown to begin with. Nevertheless, this is still a solid choice. And with that, we're finally done with the new support. Thank fucking God. Now I would like to show you a new build with the new support, but given how there's basically 4 different ways to go with it now, and this video is long enough already, I just couldn't be bothered to do so this time. I'll tell you what, go ahead and make your own deck builds with these cards and send me either a screenshot or a deck list, either in the comments or through Discord, and I'll be sure to feature it in a future video. If you want to join my currently useless Discord server, there's the Patreon thing where you can sign up to keep my channel going for just $1 a month, or you can just contact me in Davinator's Discord server if you happen to be on that. As a writer, I will admit I'm kind of biased towards literature-themed archetypes as I want to see them gain the recognition they deserve. As much as I hate Burning Abyss, I have to admit that I like the theme. However, when it comes to entities, it's very clear that Konami never seemed to give a shit about them from the beginning. I'll give them some credit for getting most of the important characters, but I fully disagree with them missing out on the one monster that should have been a requirement for the archetype. I understand that this is hitting me a lot harder due to my aforementioned preference toward literature, but when you look at how expansive and creative the source material is, it's hard to see the series as anything less than a colossal waste of potential. But hopefully with this video I was able to do at least some of the justice to this archetype that Konami seems adamantly reluctant to do. Well, at least it's still a good archetype in my dreams. Okay, that took way too long. Now I have to go and edit this monstrosity. Anyway, as usual, let me know what you think in the comments below and let me know of any ideas you have as well. Again, this isn't definitive support, so any feedback is much appreciated. But thank you guys so much for watching, and until next time, don't get run over, and I'll see you guys later.